Welcome to our final interview for Streaming Media East 2022 here in Boston. We've got with me Dom Robinson, who has a shirt on that says id3as, that is his company, but we're actually going to talk about something more interesting, at least I think. Dom and I wrote an article in between the last streaming media and in-person streaming media and now, called The Greening of Streaming. And that article, of course, Eric asked us to take a look at. You were starting to get interested in sort of the efficiencies, as we talked about price and performance before. And out of that, it has led to sort of a movement with greening of streaming. So just let's recap briefly sort of the greening of streaming journey.
So we wrote the article Greening of Streaming. I thought the idea, the name was a catchy phrase. Registered the domain, stuck an email catch-all at the back of the domain name, and then at the last sort of 4 virtual content delivery summits before this week, which I was helping run for Streaming Media, we started the conversation with the industry, asking where people's sort of mindsets were at with issues around sustainability in terms of the energy we're using within all the technologies that we're streaming with.
And as a matter of fact, just to interject real quick, I went back and watched part of that interview with the fireside chat from id3as with Vinay and Mike from Akamai. And at the end of it, you said to people, tell us what you know about greening and power efficiency, because we're a bit naive to the language on it. And obviously, so one of the things that we've had to do is figure out what the language is around that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we were doing the research, the estimation and the reports, they were wildly all over the place. The terminology, watts per frame, kilograms of carbon per hour, it's all really, really different to come to any consensus about what anyone in the industry was talking about. And in fact, I think until we started asking the questions, everyone was saying, I don't know, it's the finance director's decision. He buys the green electrons. And it was left there. So once we started the conversation, these bigger companies, Akamai particularly and Intel stand out, went out and really started to drill into their sustainability story. And so by the second and third content delivery summit, we were starting to get panels, we were starting to get the discussion going. You know, one of the sort of premises you mentioned a second ago that we put forward was this idea that, you know, the CDN industry in particular spent first 10, 15 years of its life focused on price. We forget that. We think it's all about performance because the more recent decade, it's all been about performance. But the first decade was all about making it affordable to get high capacity content or high data weight content.
And as a matter of fact, if you'd have large audiences like we have today, your company who is using the CDN services would be out of business because it couldn't afford to pay the bill.
Because they'd get a big bill, exactly. So we spent, you know, more than a decade actually focused on getting it to work affordably so that you could then launch models where people could say, oh, I haven't quite got the quality I want. So then we spent another decade getting the quality to the point where it exceeded, you know, it was good enough that the consumer opted in. But nobody had ever thought about the power efficiency.
True.
So in the last 2 years with id3as, that conversation's firmly begun. Greening of Streaming as a catch-all email group grew, and so we decided to proposition that community to come together to have a sort of full-day online event talking about this, which we did last September. But as momentum for that was coming together, we realized that there was going to be critical mass to create a trade association. So that was essentially our launch event.
And we've had, so besides the language portion, which is Working Group 1 and the lexicon, we have several other working groups. Working Group 2, which you're working with now, around sort of getting the messaging out. But what are Working Groups 3 and 4?
So just to actually explain what the working groups are, basically as the membership formed and came together, the first and most important rule of the club, if you like, Fight Club, is no greenwashing. So while there's no really formal written constitution at this stage, and that may happen certainly within context of working groups, maybe broadly across greening and streaming, this gentleman's agreement, if you like, of no greenwashing has been powerful. We're now peer reviewing each other to make sure that our marketing doesn't make claims that are unsubstantiated just to try to win competitive sustainability points which aren't really when you look at the big picture, sustainable. So anyway, got together, formed these working groups, 1 and 2, which were kind of mechanical and baseline things. And then the best practices working group, we couldn't really kick that off at first, which is kind of the long-term aim is to share best practices amongst the community, but we couldn't kick off the best practices group without knowing, if you like, where the needle is.
Right. And
so
that led to working
that
group
led to
4,
working group 4, which is really the one that's got the sort of got the legs on the whole thing. So the null hypothesis is, or let's set some context. Most people at the moment think that there's a linear relationship between the amount of bandwidth you use and how unsustainable or how much energy you use.
Right.
And therefore there's this idea that if you save bandwidth, you're greener.
Right.
And actually, when you start to look at the whole thing with a system-wide view, you discover that actually you're provisioning everything for peak capacity most of the time, if not all the time.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if you're sending any data or not. If you go from 0 to 30 million users and back again, the system energy stays pretty level. That's the null hypothesis. And nobody's got any real data. So we've got some pretty interesting organizations that have joined up, AMD, Intel on one side on the sort of chip and fabric level, Akamai, Atom, Cortex, Broadpeak, these guys are in the operator networks, Varnish as well. I'm never going to be able to remember all the members, so apologies to those members that are checking for their names, but check the website for those guys. But these guys are deployed widely across these infrastructures, and we've said to them, let's get some instrumentation going into the network where we're all agreed on the measure that they're taking, and let's
actually start to measure.
Let's aggregate that, and then let's not mark our own homework with the industry. We're going to have a transparency problem if we do that.
Right.
So we've engaged Bristol University in the UK in the first place. We may well engage others to mark our homework for us.
Okay.
They're climate scientists. They have models which are extrapolated from lab tests and haven't until now had a lot of real-world data. So working as a team with them, we can give them real-world data to increase the resolution of that information. And very early indications are that the null hypothesis has got some legs. And so it's changing the discussion. We can no longer say, oh, my codec's a little bit more efficient. You might be pushing the problem off to another part of the network. So we need to take a system-wide view and make sure that we understand that before we make these marketing claims, which inadvertently, I think, but could be very misleading.
Exactly. Dom, thank you, as always. And
come on June the 8th.
Yeah. Oh, and June the 8th, we're also going to be presenting at Parliament on this topic as well. So, sorry, that's sort of the aside thing, isn't it? We're all focused on getting
the engineering
engineering piece, but we have to remember that from a outreach standpoint, we've had some interest in the UK Parliament as well. So that's it for this year's Stream Media East 2022 interviews. We look forward to seeing you the next time we're in person. I'm not going to actually give a date or anything because 3 years ago I said next June in Boston, and here we are 3 years later in Boston finally. So, all right, thank you again.